Everybody's here. Good morning. For those of you that don't know me, David Atkins from Policy Division of the Office of General Counsel here at the Federal Election Commission. And you're here for our training on the new rule governing participation by federal candidates and office holders at non-federal fundraisers. Our goal today is simple. We're going to give you an overview of new 11 CFR 300.64. There's three main parts to the rule. The first is the scope section. The second is the rules governing participation at these types of fundraising events. And then the third rule, and what I think is the most important part of the rule, is the rules governing, or the section governing publicity in connection with these events. So we're going to go through those section by section, and we'll also have some examples to sort of aid you in your understanding of the rule. The discussion of how federal candidates and office holders can participate in fundraisers is sort of necessarily set against the backdrop of the statute's soft money restrictions. And specifically, as you probably all know, federal candidates and office holders are restricted in the types and amounts of funds they can solicit in connection with elections. What this means generally is that federal candidates and office holders can't raise corporate dollars, can't raise money from labor organizations, and they can't raise large individual contributions from individuals, But the statute also says that federal candidates and office holders can participate in fundraising events, specifically fundraising events where soft money is raised. They can attend those events, they can speak at those events, they can even be featured guests at those events. And that was part of the interpretation that was put forward in Chase 3. To attend, to speak at, to be a featured guest at these events is not in and of itself a solicitation. So you can see that there's this interesting dynamic that starts to emerge. It's a tension. Federal candidates and office holders can't solicit soft money, but they can actively participate in events where soft money is solicited by others. So the trick becomes letting federal candidates and office holders know, how do you participate without crossing the line and make an impermissible solicitation? And that's going to be a dynamic that you're going to want to keep in mind as we go through the rule, because it obviously informs the rule. This rule is designed to draw the line for federal candidates and office holders to know you can do this amount of participation up to here, and once you cross it, you're soliciting soft money, and that's a big no-no. So that's an important dynamic. Keep that in mind. Any questions about that? Good. All right, well, let's go ahead and get through the rule. As I mentioned, there's three main parts: the scope section, rules for participation at the event, and rules for publicity associated with the event. We'll start with the scope section. As you probably gathered from what I've been saying so far, we're concerned with participation by federal candidates and office holders, and that's both at the event and in the related publicity, at these quote-unquote non-federal fundraising events. What does that mean? It's sort of a quasi-defined term. There's no definition in the regs, and the scope section sort of defines it, but what it's meant to include is fundraising events that are in connection with an election, either for federal office or a non-federal election, where there is solicited funds outside the limitations and prohibitions of the Act. So we're talking about fundraising events for state parties, local party committees, 527 organizations, state candidates, state PACs, any fundraising event where at the event they're soliciting money outside the limitations and prohibitions of the Act. So primarily we're going to be talking about fundraising events in states that are corporate states, that allow contributions from corporations, labor organizations, that don't have a limit on individual contributions lower than what the federal limitation is. What we're not talking about here is charity events that aren't in any way in connection with an election. And we're not even talking about events that are in connection with an election where there's only small dollar contributions being raised from permissible sources, even if it's a non-federal election. So a federal candidate goes to a state candidate fundraiser where they're only soliciting $500 from individuals. That's going to be outside the scope of this rule. So it's not every time that a federal candidate or office holder participates in a fundraising event that 300.64 is going to be triggered. It's only with these non-federal fundraising events. And that's an important threshold determination. So is there any questions on that? No? Good. All right. Well, let's go on. That's part one. So we'll go ahead and skip to part two. For those of you following along, we're now in paragraph B. And these are the rules that govern federal candidate and office holder participation at the events themselves. And this paragraph answers the question, how do I, a federal candidate or office holder, participate at these fundraising events, your Lincoln Douglas Day dinner, your annual big party event in that state, without having my participation cross over the line into a solicitation of soft money? Let's start with what they cannot do. And it's pretty obvious, pretty straightforward. Can't solicit funds outside the limitations and prohibitions of the Act. Can't solicit levy funds. No mystery there. What can they do? Well, They can attend, they can speak, they can be a featured guest, because we know from the statute that those things are not of themselves solicitations. They can also solicit funds, so long as the solicitation is limited to funds within the limitations and prohibitions of the Act. Now, that's sort of an interesting dynamic that emerges there, because we're trying to prevent federal candidates and office holders from soliciting soft money. And we're saying, don't solicit soft money, but feel free to solicit, but only up to a certain amount. And that's sort of a tricky needle to thread, but there's two ways that you can do that, and they're both laid out in the rule. The first, you make a specific solicitation. And by that I mean the solicitation on its face asks for a specific amount of money, and also lets listeners know that other types of prohibited monies aren't being solicited. So, for example, hi, I'm here asking for your support. I'm not soliciting corporate funds, I'm not soliciting funds from labor organizations, I'm not soliciting funds from foreign nationals. What I am asking for is $2,400 from individuals, and if there are any PACs in the audience, we'd love your $5,000 contribution too. That's a specific solicitation that could be made. Theoretically, it would be in compliance with the rule. Another way to limit your solicitation, and probably the more common way that you're going to see in practice, is to issue a disclaimer. And the disclaimer can be either oral or written, but either way it has to be clear and conspicuous. So what does that mean? Well, if it's a written solicitation, a written disclaimer, you could put a placard, for example, at the entrance to the event. So we're having a Lincoln Douglas Day dinner in the ballroom of the big hotel in town. Put a big placard at the doorway to that event that says, federal candidate so-and-so will be appearing tonight, and he will be soliciting your support funds from you. But he is not soliciting X, Y, and Z. He's not soliciting corporate dollars, he's not soliciting labor organization dollars, and he's only soliciting up to $2,400 from individuals. You could also put a table card, like at the center of each table, maybe even in the flowers that are in the middle of the table. Put something there with the same message. Not soliciting this much, only soliciting this much. Or, a card on the plate, something like that, that lets folks know the solicitation you're going to hear from this federal candidate or office holder is only for certain amounts of funds that are within the limitations and prohibitions of the Act. That would be a written disclaimer. An oral disclaimer would be issued either by the federal candidate, him or herself, or by the MC of the event, for example. They get up at the beginning, before the program kicks off, and says, we're really excited to have Senator Jones here tonight. She'll be speaking later. She'll probably be asking for your support, but just so you know, she's only asking for individual and PAC contributions. You corporations out there, she's not asking for money from you, even though I am, but she's not asking for contributions from you. The important thing to remember is that once one of those disclaimers is issued, either in written form or orally, it's going to disclaim any subsequent solicitation by that federal candidate or office holder. And that's whether it's to the group or on a one-on-one basis at the event. And that means that it frees up the federal candidate or office holder to make general solicitations of funds that are presumed to be disclaimed by the earlier issued written or oral disclaimer. So those are the rules for participation at the event. Are there any questions? Good, okay. Parts 1 and 2 are behind us, so now we're going to move on to publicity. The publicity portion of this rule, I think, was the most important for a couple of reasons. The first, the dynamic that I just described doesn't often happen. Folks are usually solicited before the event takes place. In fact, the contribution is almost always a precondition to getting into the event itself. So you've been asked to give money to buy a ticket, to buy a seat, to buy a table, before the events even happen. And once you get there, all that's behind us. So publicity is really where the bulk of the fundraising takes place. Furthermore, it's publicity that most bedeviled the Commission in the years leading up to this rulemaking. Before we get started on what the specific rules are, let's just make sure that we're all on the same page about what we mean when we say publicity. And it's a term that's broadly understood. It means not just an invitation to an event, but a save the date, a follow-up, mailer. It could be oral as well. It could be a phone call, a phone bank that a state party uses to call all the invitees to an event and really hammer home that they need people to come out to this event and give contributions. So it's oral or written in any format. So a mailer, an email, could be a radio advertisement theoretically, it could be something in the paper, but it's a broadly understood term. As far as what the rules are for the publicity, we're again coming back to that tension that's in the statute. How does a federal candidate or office holder participate in the publicity for one of these non-federal fundraising events without having that participation slip across the line into a solicitation of soft money? And to a large extent, that answer is going to hinge on what the publicity itself says. What does the publicity on its face do? If it contains a solicitation of soft money, then there's going to be some pretty stringent restrictions on how that federal candidate or office holder can be named, can be featured, because there's more of likelihood that federal candidate or office holder could be perceived to be making a solicitation of soft money. If, however, the publicity doesn't contain a solicitation at all, so it's something that just save the date, it doesn't talk about the cost of a ticket or a table, or it's a piece of publicity that solicits funds, but funds within the limitations and prohibitions of the Act, then there's not going to be any restriction on the way that that federal candidate or office holder can be named on the publicity. This table sort of points that out. We'll go through a couple of examples now to flesh that out, and we'll see how that operates. So we've got our first example here. This is a save the date, I guess you could call it, for the Shangri-La State Republican Party. And it notices that they're having some fundraising event. We can presume it's a non-federal fundraising event because otherwise it wouldn't be under the purview of New 300.64. But on the face of the publicity, there is no solicitation of funds. And therefore, there's not going to be any restriction on how, in this case, Congressman Doe is going to be named. There's not going to be any additional disclaimer requirements down here. As you'll see, there will be in subsequent pieces of publicity that do have solicitations of soft money on their face. But the takeaway here is that this is just fine. There's no problem under the new rule with a piece of publicity like this. Let's go to another example. Here we do have a solicitation, but it's a limited solicitation. $500 contribution, seemingly from just individuals. We got corporations, labor organizations, national banks, contractors, foreign nationals. They're not being solicited. We're talking about an individual contribution of $500 to get into the door of this event. And that's a solicitation that Senator Smith here could make herself. Accordingly, there's no concern about her publicity, her participation in this publicity being attributed to her because she could make that solicitation herself. Accordingly, there's no restriction on the way she can be named, and there's no requirement to add any special disclaimer language down here letting folks know that Senator Smith is not the one doing the solicitation. All right, any questions on those two pieces of publicity? Because that's 2/3 of the publicity rules, paragraph C1 and C2 if you're following along. So we've covered the first two types here. These are really the easy parts. No solicitation on the publicity or a limited solicitation of hard money on the publicity, excuse me. No solicitation on the publicity and a limited solicitation on the publicity. That's not going to pose any problem. It's not going to trigger any additional requirements. It's when we're talking about publicity that on its face solicits soft money, funds outside the limitations and prohibitions of the Act, that you're going to see in paragraph C3 really starts to trigger some additional requirements that are preconditions to the federal candidate or office holder being named or featured in the publicity. And there's two. The first, federal candidate or office holder can't be named in a manner specifically related to fundraising. In addition, there has to be clear and conspicuous disclaimer language that lets the reader or the recipient of the publicity know that it's not the federal candidate or office holder that's soliciting funds. And this is really a belt and suspenders type approach. It's an and. You've got to have both in order to be in compliance with the terms of C3. But they don't add anything to one another. It's really just to make abundantly clear to the recipient of the publicity that it is somebody else other than this federal candidate or office holder that is making the solicitation of soft money that you see on that invitation. So let's drill down into these a little bit more. What does it mean to be identified in a manner not specifically related to fundraising? Well, the rule lays out 5 titles, I guess, or terms that you can use. Featured guest, honored guest, special guest, featured speaker, honored speaker. Those are all roles, titles, what have you, that in the Commission's determination are not specifically related to fundraising, that are legitimate ways to identify federal candidates or office holders that aren't intricately tied to the fundraising capacity. So you can name a federal candidate or office holder, identify them in this role, and not have a concern of the soft money solicitation being attributed to them. Importantly, this is not an exhaustive list. There are, theoretically, other roles, other titles that can be used to identify a federal candidate or office holder. Why you would stray from this list of 5 is unclear to me, but you theoretically could, and just leave it up to the Commission to decide after the fact whether you were right. There is one way discussed in the E&J that you could add to this list right now, and that's to not really identify the federal candidate or office holder in any role at all. So that's the first thing, being identified in a manner not specifically related to fundraising. You also have to have a clear and conspicuous disclaimer on the publicity that indicates that it's not the federal candidate or office holder that's the one doing the soliciting. That disclaimer can be written or oral, And that makes sense because the publicity can be written or oral. So with written publicity, you need a written disclaimer. With oral publicity, you need an oral disclaimer. For written disclaimers, written publicity, the disclaimer has to be consistent with the standards of the paid-for-by requirements in 11 CFR 110.11c2. So it's going to be in your box. It's going to have a font size of an appropriate font size, a good amount of contrast between the background and the font itself. All of those requirements are going to attach to the disclaimer you're going to have to put on because of 300.64. If it's oral publicity, it's required. It also must be clear and conspicuous, but only if the oral publicity is conducted according to a scripted or organized program. And what that means is, like a state party, for example, sends out invitations to all its members to an upcoming fundraising event where non-federal funds are going to be solicited. And then a week later, they have all their employees or volunteers follow up with those invitees by phone to say, hey, we hope you got our invitation and we really hope that you're going to be coming. Mention that a federal candidate is going to be in attendance or is going to be speaking or something like that. Then they would have to also give a disclaimer letting the recipient of that phone call know that the federal candidate is not going to be the one doing the solicitation. If the oral publicity is informal, though, there is no disclaimer requirement that attaches. And so there you can think of a dynamic like a state candidate is having a fundraiser next week. And invitations have gone out, and then that state candidate is walking down the street and runs into a longtime supporter. And he says, hey Joe, I hope you got my invitation. I really hope you can make it. We're doing a push for the general, and I need your support. Also, if you could let the CEO of your company know that he's invited to come and we could use the company support as well, that would be great. I just talked to the congressman. He's going to be in the district. He's going to be dropping by and saying a few words. So you've got a solicitation of soft money there in connection with a non-federal fundraising event, and there's been a reference to the federal candidate. But because that's sort of an informal, offhand conversation, the FEC has determined that they're not going to impose disclaimer requirements on that sort of on-the-street, informal conversation. So that's an important distinction to recognize. All right, let's take a look at a few examples here to flesh these requirements out. We've got another invitation. This one's for a fundraising event for a gubernatorial candidate. And it's Senator Doe, again, is going to be the featured guest. And here we see on the face of the publicity, we've got a contribution or a solicitation of $20,000. It's a soft money solicitation. So we're going to trigger the requirements of paragraph C in 300.64. So we ask two questions. First of all, is the federal candidate identified in a manner not specifically related to fundraising? And the answer is yes. Featured guest is one of the 5 roles that are included in the rule, and so that's just fine. And then the next thing we have to ask is there appropriate disclaimer language on the publicity? And here the answer is yes. We've got solicitations of funds in connection with this event are by Mary Jones for governor and not by Senator Doe. So folks here know that Senator Doe is just a featured guest, and they're not the ones doing any solicitation here, as made clear by the language inside this box. So this is a permissible piece of publicity. The federal candidate is not in jeopardy of being accused of soliciting soft money. Let's take a look at another example. This is a party event. Again, fundraiser that's going to be attended by Senator Doe. He or she is going to be the honored speaker of this event. And again, we've got a solicitation of $20,000. It's a soft money solicitation. Senator Doe can't make that solicitation themselves, him or herself. So we ask the same 2 questions again. Are they identified in a manner not specifically related to fundraising? Yes. And do we have the disclaimer language? Yes, we do. So again, permissible. This would be just fine. Senator Doe can sign off on being on this piece of publicity without reservation. All right, let's go ahead and go to the flip side of this. If we've got a piece of publicity that has a soft money solicitation, we know how folks can conduct themselves, but we want to know what can't they do. When are they going to run into trouble with the way that they're named on a piece of publicity? Well, if they have to be identified in a manner not specifically related to fundraising, it sort of makes sense that they can't be identified in a manner that is specifically related to fundraising. So what does that mean? Well, the rule points out 2 titles that are big no-nos. That's honorary chairperson or host committee. Those titles actually go back to the 2002 rulemaking that was done right after Bicker. We've always sort of determined that those are roles that are so inherently tied to the fundraising role that if you're publicized as serving them, then you are in effect making a solicitation. Furthermore, you cannot extend the invitation. If you're a federal candidate or office holder, you can't be identified on the publicity as being the one doing the inviting. So while the Republican Party can invite you to an event with Senator Smith can't invite you to an event for the Republican Party. Signing the publicity, also a big no-no, and that's usually going to come up in the case of a fundraising letter. So it's addressed to any number of constituents or members of the party, and lays out all the reasons that that support is needed. And then it's signed by the candidate or the party president or chair, and then also a federal candidate. That's going to be a solicitation by the federal candidate or office holder, and if it's for soft money, it's obviously prohibited. Importantly, all of these things are no-nos regardless of whether somebody also slaps on a clear and conspicuous disclaimer. So you can't cure being named as being on the host committee or extending the invitation by putting in a box at the bottom of the publicity, just kidding, I'm not really soliciting. So you can't ask for money and then in a box below say, just kidding, I'm not asking for money. Let's take a look at a couple of examples here. All right, we've got, again, a $20,000 solicitation. So it's a soft money solicitation, and we have a federal candidate that is named on the publicity. So we ask our two questions. Are they identified in a manner not specifically related to fundraising? Well, they're not identified, but they're the ones that are doing the inviting. And as we know, that's a big no-no, and therefore the analysis ends. The federal candidate or office holder can't be featured on that publicity in that way without running afoul of 300.64C. So they're going to have to change this up a little bit. And even though you see that there's disclaimer language down here indicating that the solicitation is by the party and not by the congressman, it doesn't matter. Take a look at another example. Same solicitation of $20,000. This time it's for the Democratic Party, and we've got a federal candidate, this time identified as honorary chair. And of course, honorary chair is one of the two no-no titles. So the analysis ends. This is an impermissible piece of publicity, and the fact that there is disclaimer language down here doesn't cure the impermissible identification at the top. Now, let me just circle back for a second. You see here, we said that honorary chair and member of the host committee. Those were two titles that were absolutely prohibited. But I think it's important to remember that they're prohibited only if the publicity on its face solicits soft money. If you go back and look at the first two examples that we had, here Congressman Doe is identified as honorary chair. But it's not a problem there because there's no solicitation of soft money on the face of this publicity. You go to the next example, solicitation not for soft money, so it's just fine to have event chairwoman, U.S. Senator Jane Smith, be identified in that way. So it all sort of hinges on what the publicity says on its face. Any questions about any of that? Dissemination. All right, on dissemination, that's going to be another absolute no-no, and that's regardless of how the federal candidate or office holder is identified. If they're identified in a role not specifically related to fundraising and you've got your appropriate disclaimer language, everything is good about the publicity itself. If it solicits soft money, then that federal candidate or office holder can't send that publicity out themselves. They can't email it from their account, they can't post it on their website, they can't send it out on campaign letterhead, send it out in a campaign envelope. They can't be the ones sending it out because the act of sending it out is, in the view of the commission, tantamount to a solicitation. So that's a big no-no, and there's no exceptions to that. And then one final note, I mentioned before that this rule sort of consolidated and clarified previous guidance that had been issued by the commission in a number of places, including advisory opinions. There were 3 big advisory opinions that discussed these topics before the rulemaking. There was Cantor in 2003, also RGA in 2003, and then in 2007 we had the California State Parties AO. All of those AOs, to the extent that they overlap with this rulemaking, have been superseded. And that's not necessarily because this rulemaking is inconsistent with these AOs. And in fact, the Cantor AOs is, I think, the basis for a lot of what's in this rulemaking. But the commission made the judgment that they wanted to sort of start fresh, wipe the slate clean, and have folks only have to consider and look at one source and try and figure out how they can conduct themselves at non-federal fundraising events. So if in the future you're presented with an issue about federal candidate and office holder participation in non-federal fundraising events, look no further than 300.64.